Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am BorderWise and welcome to the From the Depths Armor Tutorial Part 2. Last time we covered the basics of how armor works and what blocks count as armor, and a little bit on how you should arrange your armored beams when you want to build your craft. Today, what this is mostly going to be is us taking a grand tour of a fortress that Wellner has so kindly provided me. Thank you, Wellner. And this is basically showcasing the various types of damage and how to armor against them. And it's a pretty sweet. This is actually a very good looking fortress, despite the fact that it's for armor testing. Look, there's even friggin' poles on here. There's poles and there's railings and artistic bits and pieces everywhere. It's lovely. Lovely. Well, now you've done a good job. So to start off with, we're going to start with arguably the simple. I say simple. There's nothing simple about any of this. We're going to start with the simple thing, which is kinetic damage. And for that, what we have here is a monster kinetic shell. And on this one is around 350 millimeters. So lots of kinetic damage, high armor piercing, lots of gunpowder casings, 2 sabot warheads, and 1 AP capped head. So this is a dedicated armor busting projectile that we've got in this weak gun here. And also, we're gonna just get out our armor monitoring device. Beep, beep, beep. Yes, that is armor. Okay, so first things first, there's a little bit of math to go over. So to start off with, we're in the kinetic section. So the formula for calculating kinetic damage goes something like this. It is the armor penetration value of the projectile times the kinetic damage it does should equal twice the armor class of the block it's hitting times the block's health. So if you want your kinetic round to kill a block in one shot, it needs to essentially have double the armor penetration, because remember, the kinetic damage should at least equal the health of the block, and since you times the AP by the KD and times AC by H, you're gonna need 2 times armor penetration. So, in practice, however, you're gonna want a lot more kinetic damage than that, because, well, these blocks have a fair bit of armor and they have a lot of health. So here we have 4 layers of metal, so that's 2,100, 4,200, 6,000, no wait, 2,100, 4,200, 6,300 health, 6,300 plus 6,000, so that's 12,300 health to get through. Which means that you're going to need a lot of kinetic damage and a lot of AP. So, with that in mind, let's start shooting things. We've got here's the shell again, just in case you missed it. That's the damage it does. Is this 350? Yes, it is. And so let's fire it. Does it get through this armor setup? No, it does not. This particular shell was stopped 2 layers in, neatly stopped just before it managed to get through this one. And this metal block in here is still a nice, rudely healthy 75% health. So, this armor setup here is the kind of thing you'd put on the side of a ship if you're worried about railguns shooting at you and stuff like that. Possibly a bit thicker than that if it's an actual railgun, because this isn't a railgun. This is just regular gunpowder. So, we covered last time how armor stacking works. You put high armored stuff behind slightly weaker stuff, and the weaker stuff is made stronger. Nice and simple. So, the main reason that you have this corner is to show off how precise armor stacking is. So, if we wave our wand over here, you would have seen this last time, and you can see it for yourself, is that number down there, the AC, keeps changing. It is very, very precise how it calculates the health of... It's really precise how it calculates armor stacking and what precise line it's on. So, looking over here and keeping in mind that this gun is pointing at a section that is 2 layers of metal and 1 layer of heavy armor, what happens here? What happens here is it loses 1, 2 layers of metal and scratch the heavy armor behind it. So, arguably not a huge amount of difference. However, when you come to it, there's other things to worry about. So over here, we have a gun set at an angle. So this gun over here is shooting kind of diagonally through these beams. So shooting through more metal, proportionally, and the heavy armor's behind it. So, what happens here? That happens. So what you have is you have a missing block, destroyed block, and you have a very heavily damaged beam right there. So that's fine. It didn't get anywhere near through because it's got an awful lot of metal to shoot through, and that's backed by heavy armor. So what happens if you go over here? Ah, I appear to be building on the thing. So over here, this gun is pointed through here. And I should probably repair that. And I should probably do this as well. There we go, all our blocks are healthy again. So, keeping that in mind, what happens when we shoot at this one? Bang! So now you've lost more blocks. You have lost... What? Why didn't I... Yeah, there we go. There we go! So now that's 2 blocks destroyed and a third one that is damaged. So why is that? It's because there is a line. Let's go over here so we can go on the line accurately. Following this line. No. There is no heavy armor on this line here. And that is why this particular form of armor arrangement, where you've got a staggered heavy armor, isn't as good as just having a solid line of heavy armor behind here, because it's less consistent. It means that there are lines through your armor that don't get that full armor stacking bonus from the heavy armor. And this same would apply if the metal here was wood and the heavy armor was, I don't know, stone or something like that. You don't want to space out your armor, because this essentially makes slim holes. And that's no good. So this is something that a Wilner made just to debunk a kind of myth that this gives the exact same results as this. So yeah, we know that now, that's on screen, we all know that. So moving on, so here we have arrangement, and I touched on this a little bit last time. It's horizontal beams, vertical beams, crosshatch beams. Now, last time I was a little bit came across a little bit too negative about crosshatching. It's okay. The difference between these 3 types of armor arrangement is actually pretty minimal. It's just that crosshatching introduces like a few new benefits, but also a few new disadvantages, and I was possibly a little bit too sour on that. That's my bad. Any case, so the good news is that, well, good news, I guess it's just news, is that with really big kinetic power shells, as I'm going to be calling them from now on, there's not much difference in how you arrange the armor, because these things just tend to punch straight through it. So there, that's the vertical beams, and it punches straight through it. You'll notice that shell was slowed down considerably by these layers of metal. And now we have the horizontal beams. What happens there? Also slowed down considerably, but it still put a nice little hole clean through that wall of AI connectors. So, cross-hatching, what happens? Whoop! Bang! So, same thing once again, slowed down a lot, put a hole through the AI connectors, and as I touched on before, the main difference between this and the other ones is that if you cross-hatch, you risk, when blocks in the middle are destroyed, it means these blocks here, in the second layer, and in this case, the last layer, they don't get armor stacking anymore. So, that is a risk you will have to accept if you decide to use cross-hatching. All the more power to you. So, moving on from there. So, with big kinetics, this makes no difference. However, with high explosive damage, I should mention, cross-hatching in particular does make a difference, and so does using vertical blocks. And against frags as well. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, now, on to slopes. Now, slopes are wonderful, wonderful things. I just tapped my phone. Why did I do that? No, everything's going wrong. Phone does phone What? Okay, never mind. I don't know what I did there, but it's okay. I'll figure it out later. So, what we have here are 4 sets of slopes. We have 1 meter slopes, which in this case is 4 meter diagonal cuts. We have 2 meter slopes, and we have 3 meter slopes and 4 meter slopes. Now, the formula, the slopes have a specific thing with them. Their formula for calculating kinetic damage is a little bit different from regular blocks. Or rather, they get an added bonus. Slopes have get reduced damage from kinetic projectiles if they're hit like on extreme angles. So the formula for that, which will go on screen right now because I'm not sure I can even read it out properly, the formula for bouncing them, as in the projectile failing to penetrate and just bouncing off, is this. So, bang, it's up there. I can't even friggin' read that. I'm that bad at math. So, it looks like that. I hope all you mathsy people are taking note, and the non-mathsy people, I'm so sorry, but this game has maths in it. And then you have the slope damage multiplier, which thank the gods I can read out. So, with a 1 meter slope is essentially skipping ahead, like, darn it, why didn't I write down the formula for this? I had it and everything, but basically, a 1 meter slope, like this one, takes 71% damage from an incoming kinetic round, or fragment. So, reduced damage, not a huge reduction, but still a reduction. A 2 meter slope takes 44% damage from an incoming thing, and these are big kinetic shells, so arguably not the best testing round for this, but you'll see the difference in a second. So, 2 meter slope, 44%, you get the 33, no, not 33, the 3 meter slope, that's 31% damage, so less of a difference between the 1 meter and the 2 meter, but then between the 2 meter and the 3 meter, but still, it's getting there. These things take greatly reduced damage from incoming kinetics, and then you get the 4 meter slope, which is a whopping only 24% damage of incoming kinetic rounds. So what does that look like? Well, it looks something like this. So we've got our nice spongy AI connectors behind there. Activate this ACB, bang, 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 and bang. You'll notice some shells are flying off into space. So remembering that bounce formula right there, which I can't read, it's basically the more the extreme the angle, the more likely the shell is to bounce. It's pretty logical, actually. So what happened here is that beam wasn't quite enough, it got killed, and it put a hole straight through the AI connectors. Same thing over here, monster kinetic shell, made no difference, and went right through here. Then you get to here, and hello, this thing's only 31% health. Admittedly, this has more health. These bigger beams have more health than these smaller ones, but the difference isn't great. So over here we got a 2000 health block right here. Over here we have a 1500 health block, and this managed to bounce that shell. So long slopes are very good for this. And as for over here, 63% health. This whopping monster of a kinetic shell, let me show you again what's being shot here. This shell didn't penetrate it and didn't even destroy that block. Admittedly, this is heavy armor, but still, that's a big shell. And sent it sailing off into space, where it can harm no one except aliens, and frankly, screw aliens with their anal probing. That got weird, sorry. Anyway, so slopes are amazing and are pretty good for stopping kinetic damage ruining your life. The problem is that's all they're good at. They are not good against high explosive. Inertially fused high explosive doesn't give a damn about slopes. Energy weapons such as lasers and particle cannons, they're not affected by slopes at all. They're not affected by armor stacking either, so that's also a bit annoying. Missiles don't care. Well, missiles with frag certainly care. And it's just slopes are such an awesome mechanic and so true to real life that, I don't know, personally I find it a bit of a bummer they're not more useful. But they can still be pretty darn awesome if you say if you have a front-siding craft with a nose that looks something like this, with extremely an extremely sloping front, it will do pretty darn well against incoming kinetic shells and fragments and all that stuff. So, you can also put these on the inside of a craft, so the inner citadel surrounding ammunition storage or AI compartments. You can have slopes on them, so if something like a heat or HESH round hits your craft, the fragments spawn inside, they bounce off, and you're still happy. Getting ahead of myself again. So, that is slopes. Slopes are lovely. And over here, we now have a little bit of an experiment to do with origin points. Now, origin points the origin point of a block is the bit which you rotate around. It's that green dot on this preview beam right here. And Wellner, in Scientific Endeavor, was trying to figure out whether it makes a difference which way the origin point is pointing and how close it is to incoming damage. Now, the thing is, with kinetic damage, it makes no difference. So, origin point is further away from the damage here. We've got a nice 200mm kinetic shell. What happens here is this. Ouch, that was loud. So here we got the shell, failed to penetrate, 15% health, so it took off like, what? Almost 2,000, more like 1,900 health, but didn't penetrate. Okay, so that's when the origin point is away from the incoming shell. This over here is the opposite. It is when the origin point is the first thing that gets hit. Is there a difference? No, there is no difference whatsoever. So for kinetics, the origin point doesn't matter. You can arrange your beams pointing however you like, really, and it doesn't actually make a difference with kinetic shells. Over here, we have another thing that Wellner was experimenting with, and that is with the ERA, which is Explosive Reactive Armor. It's this stuff. It actually does anything against kinetics, and, well, we'll show you what happens. The answer is that it does absolutely jack diddly against kinetic rounds, so I forget in real life whether ERA does anything against kinetic shells, but certainly in this game, it does not do anything. That shell sailed clean through the ERA. Well, it sailed through 2 layers of metal, through the ERA, through 2 more layers of layered metal, and then took out the candy floss right behind here. So, ERA does nothing against kinetics, so if you're using it for that reason, do not bother, that's not what it's for. It does have uses, and we'll get to that in a second. And now, last but not least, it's how should you layer your stuff against kinetic shells? We've kind of touched on that a little bit, but the trick is you want to maximize the health of your blocks, and just layers of health, essentially, rather than layers of armor. So, what we have here is a sandwich of stone, with metal acting as the bread, and then we have toast, with the stone acting as the jam, and the metal acting as an extra nice thick of rye bread. Delicious. I haven't had lunch yet. So, this is exactly the same material cost and number of blocks, but is there a difference between the two? The answer is, well, the answer is yes, but we'll get to that in a second. So how did the sandwich do? The sandwich did poorly. That block sailed straight through, destroyed that, and poked a hole in the candy floss behind it. So that's annoying, because what we have here is a block in front that has over 2,000 health and about 35 AC, thanks to stacking, and that sailed straight through it. So, compared with that, what you have here is a layer of stone, with an AC also of 35 and less health, so logically, this should sail straight through as well. However, it does not. Why does it not do that? Well, the kinetic damage was, if we look here, this is 250 millimeters. Whoops, wrong button. So if we look here, 250 mil. So what we have here is a lot of kinetic damage, and not enough armor piercing to do full damage to that first stone block there, which means the kinetic damage was basically exhausted by this stone block. And then it hit a block with real armor. So that's what stopped it right here, right at this metal block right there. It's a subtle difference, but it can mean the difference between getting a hole poked in your candy floss and not. Why am I calling this stuff candy floss? It must be the... Candy floss isn't even that color, that's just weird. So, if you are preparing to armor against kinetic power shells, and this isn't just APS, it's things like crams as well, what you want to do is you want to layer on the health in front and layer on the armor behind, which is why those of you who watch tournaments, you will see a lot of craft, particularly in cram-only tournaments. Hi Menti, how's it going? You will see a lot of stone backed by heavy metal, well, not heavy metal, it's backed by either metal or heavy armor, because the stone, given an armor boost, tends to exhaust kinetic damage and stops things penetrating through. So, stone is great for that. Stone is lovely. That concludes the kinetic power shell section of this fortress, and we'll move on to frags. Frags are my favorite. Now, fragments have the same armor penetration calculation as regular kinetics do. So, it's the same thing. It is AP times KD equals 2AC times H. So, that's pretty much the same. The difference is that frags, as a rule, have terrible armor piercing. It is armor piercing of 6 for fragments across the board, whether it be for APS, crams, missiles, what have you. And so, you defend against them a little bit differently. You don't stack health, you stack armor. So remembering over here that, well, let's see it again. This big kinetic shell manages to punch through about 3 layers of metal with heavy armor behind it. So that's impressive penetration. Here you have a 350 millimeter frag round. So lots of frag damage, and incidentally, fragments per shell and per projectile really, except for crams. For missiles and APS is capped at 60, so any extra frags improve damage instead. So I'm not entirely sure what the formula is for that, I've never found it, but these fragments will do more than 285 damage, but AP of 6 for this damage, remember. And also it does kinetic damage, whoop, 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 whoop. It would do more than that number, and that number, and that number, so what this means is that frags do struggle against armor. So you see a lot of them just bounced off completely right there, and it only managed to destroy 1 block. This is a shell that's the same size as that big kinetic shell that we tested over there. So damage that one, damage the one beside it, damage the one beside it, damaged the ones around it, but didn't manage to penetrate all the way through. It stopped it dead. And the same goes for this one. This is the frag version of the armor stacking experiment we had over there. So over here we have this. So what we had there, we got 1 destroyed block and a bunch of slightly damaged ones around it. Same story. Exactly the same story. Incidentally, if that layer of heavy armor wasn't there, you would be losing a lot more blocks than this, because fragments are a terror against things that don't have enough armor. So, what happens if you shoot that at the same angles we were doing before? Well, much the same, really. Except not really. So, where are we? We are here. Here. So, over here we have the bog standard layered heavy armor behind metal, 1 layer. And actually, I want to go on here because that's easy to scroll. And so, what happens if we shoot this? Bang! Lots of fragments skidding off into the middle distance. That's what we like. We've got 1 destroyed block, and freaking hell, why does this always happen? Stop deselecting my tool! My tool, I say. So, what do we have here? We have a heavily damaged block, and that's it, really. That is it, that's all she wrote, because that shell is trying to shoot through... Oh, goodness me, how many layers of metal is this? Shoot through... 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of metal and a layer of heavy armor behind it. It's not going to get through that. So, we go over here. Is there any difference? Where am I? Here I am. Here I am, once again, planting the potatoes. So over here we get a slightly less damage block. And another one, which means that more shots ricochet. And the reason for that is, this is trying to shoot through 2 layers of metal, so about 1, 2, and then a layer of heavy armor. And because this is a thinner layer, that heavy armor is lending more AC to these 2 blocks here. So, what works against frags is thinner but stronger layers of armor, as opposed to with big kinetic power shells, which is thicker shells with more health. So, with frags, you need strong armor, you need high armor values if you want the fragments to be stopped, because remember, AP of 6, terrible, tends to bounce, tends to do very little. Now over here we have a little experiment. The same frag shells, big 350mm shells. I call that big, some people might not. And so here we've got vertical beams and we've got horizontal beams. Is there a difference? The answer might surprise you. Try these new diet pills for miraculous results. So, what we have here, we have a destroyed beam, we have a slightly damaged beam, 77% health, we have slightly damaged, slightly damaged, slightly damaged, and slightly damaged. Well, no, this one's not even slightly damaged. So, remembering those numbers right there, we've got 77% at the back, 93, 93, 91, and 88. So does horizontal beams make a difference in this case? The answer might surprise you. Sign on today for our limited rewards card. So what we have here is a slightly more damaged block, a slightly more damaged block on the side, this one didn't get touched, this one slightly more damaged, and slightly more damaged. So it's quite a subtle difference, but vertically stacked beams do better against frags. So let's look at that again. That's 74% behind there. And this is 77%. 93, 91. And 93, 93. So, and 91. So the reason for this is that frags seem to spread out horizontally rather than vertically. So, what that means is that you get more blocks hit by frags if you arrange your beams like this. And most of my older ships have armor arranged like this, so no wonder I friggin' hate frags. Vertical beams have less of a problem with that. So, that's basically it on the fragment section, and now we get to go to my favorite section. This is the high explosive section. The section. So, high explosive is a bit of a weird animal, and it has a different formula for calculating the damage it does to armored blocks. So, it basically takes, and put it on the screen, future me, high explosive takes 1 divided by the square root of the AC as damage multiplier. So what that means is, if you 1 divided by square root of the AC, I hope I'm reading that right. I hope when I put it on the screen people will know what I'm actually talking about. So basically, an explosion does only 26% damage to metal and only 16% to heavy armor. So that's a huge difference, and it means that you'll find that if you want to get through armored layers with heavy armor, you need either a lot of explosions or really big ones, preferably both. So what we have here is 2 blocks, kind of spaced out. We have 2 layers of metal and 5 layers of stone, which is roughly the same cost. And we've got 2 high explosive guns shooting at it. These are 500mm, so about as big as APS shells get. And so what happens if we shoot at the metal? We get this result. Bang. Love that sound. Okay, so what you end up with is a pretty heavily damaged metal block, 27% health, and then, 69, 74, 79, 84, 89, 94, 97, 100. So the HE spreads out a little bit, and up here it spreads out a little bit as well, but you'll notice, again, it spreads horizontally rather than vertically. And that's, it's just because of really how these beams are arranged, I guess. And also just, if you have an explosive here, this kind of washes to the sides of it. I don't know. Anyway, that's kind of what, that just is really what it does. Makes this lovely stain on here. And that's only 2 layers of metal. As armor goes, that's not particularly thick, and it's stopped a 500mm explosive shell. Now, what does the stone look like? The stone looks like this. Kablooey. So, initially you get similar results. You get a heavily armored piece right in the middle, that's 11% health, and you get a whole bunch of other blocks as well. The difference being is that a lot more stone gets damaged than metal. So you got, this here is the center bit, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 blocks along. Let's test over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Only 7. So it's spread out a little bit less, and this block is much more heavily damaged at 11% health. So the rule here is that stone acts as a great sponge against big, powerful kinetic shells, and its other properties besides. But metal, because of its higher armor, is better against high explosives, and it's also better against fragments. So there's your lesson there. This is why metal is generally the go-to for armor, if you don't want to think about it too much. And stone backed by metal, or pretty much combines best of both worlds. So those 2 blocks are, well, 2 block types, material types, are your go-to for armor, for the most part. Occasionally using other things. And so over here again, I should mention as well, forgot to mention this in the formula, whoops. If high explosive damage is less than 10% of a block's health, it deals no damage at all. And that is why these outside blocks here took absolutely no damage from that explosion, whereas the outside blocks here, well, did. This explosion reached further. And that is because if explosive damage does less than 10% of a block's health after calculating the armor, it does absolutely nothing. So with explosions, it is bigger is better. So small explosive rounds. So if we go here, for instance, we go here. So this is a 500mm shell, 6,000 damage. If you go down to 18mm, this is absolutely useless. It does nothing. Absolutely nothing. So with advanced cannons especially, like, explosive damage only really starts being useful around the 300mm mark, although not really. And it only starts to get actually good at, like, very high gauges, so about between 450mm to 500. 500 especially, so if you want to blow things up, use big shells. If you don't, if it's not a big shell you're using, you're better off using kinetic or frag. And flak, it goes double for flak as well, because, like, flak damage really does not scale up well, so I'm not going to mess with that right now, but suffice to say, flak is crap at low gauge. Where was I? Okay, so over here, rolling over here is that... What was I saying? Okay, so this is origin points again. So right here, you have the origin point pointing towards the place where the shell's coming from. And Well-Known has kindly painted a nice target showing off exactly what blocks get touched by this. And so what happens if you shoot at this with the origin points pointing towards us? And this is not a big explosive shell, by the way. This is 250mm. One to look at. Here we go, here we go. 250mm. Over 1500 explosive damage. That's wussy as hell. But looking over here, you see this thing's at 94% health, this thing's at 99, and, well, does pretty much nothing. Again, you'll notice that the explosion tends to spread out horizontally rather than vertically. Once again, it's a good reason to use vertical beams. Over here, we have the beams arranged the other way, and you can already tell that this is going to be a little bit different. The origin point is further away from the explosion. So, if we fire here, same 250mm shell, my throat's getting scratchy, bang. So, over there we had 99, now we have 90. Or rather, 94, sorry, 94, 90% damage. 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. So a lot more blocks were damaged, and the middle block took a lot more damage with the beams arranged this way. So, if you're worried about high explosive damage and you're arranging your beams lengthwise, put the origin point forward, because it seems to take less damage if you do that. I should mention as well, this is probably a bug. It might get fixed at some point, so I guess take advantage of it while you can. And moving on, so that's regular hold high explosive, and it's fun stuff. High explosive, as I said, armor is possibly one of the best things against it, because, well, it does crap against layers of armor. So what we have here is a whole section on specialty armor cracking explosive things. And starting with heat. Heat is very, very powerful, and for those of you who don't know, heat stands for high explosive anti-tank. In real life terms, what that means is that it's a shell that when it hits armor, it basically fires a stream of molten copper through the layers of armor, and when that molten stream hits air, it sprays out on a whole bunch of fragments, and ideally basically does nothing to the armor itself, but when it hits air, it shreds everything inside the tank. That's the idea of it. It's a very successful form of armor-piercing round. It's been used for a while, and it's kind of changed tank design quite a lot in real life because it's so potent. And in From the Depths, it works roughly the same way. It hits a layer of armor. There's a stream that goes through it, and when it hits an air gap, it sprays out that fragments. Then times previously, it could jump air gaps, so the stream could penetrate air gaps and keep going. That has been changed. And heat essentially just got buffed in that sense, because it means that split second it hits an air gap, the fragments do a lot more damage than they used to, and they tend to shred everything behind the layer of armor. So, go to armor piercing. And this array of 4 heat guns is showing off, it's basically used to demonstrate what works at stopping the heat stream and what doesn't. So, in reverse order of these guns firing, what you have here is you have 2 layers of metal, and you have applique panels. Admittedly, just one little 1x1 meters of applique panels, recently added block. Over here, you have explosive reactive armor again. So, say hello to ERA. This is where it actually is useful. Spoiler alert. Over here, you have 2 meter long heavy armor blocks. Well, heavy armor slopes. So, this counts as an air gap in here. So, what that means is, well, all of these do to a certain extent. And what that means is that when the heat penetrates through here, it'll hit that air gap and the fragments will spawn. And over here, you have metal poles. And also, this still counts as an air gap. So, all these things are basically a way of getting an air gap into the side of your armor without actually leaving a blank spot. So, let's just see how well these do. Okay, and in reverse, well, same order we did, what you get is that you get this damage block right here. That's mostly due to kinetic damage and explosive damage of the shell. And you get, well, much damaged block in here. And nice hole blown clean through this applique. In fact, multiple of them destroyed because of the fragments. A missing block and a heavily damaged metal beam right here. So applique doesn't count as a structural block, which means heat doesn't penetrate it. However, it's so flimsy that it means that the heat fragments just shred it and will shred whatever is behind it. So it's pretty damn useless. Like I've said it before, I'll say it again. These applique panels are essentially decoration at the moment. They're not good armor. They're not armor at all, really. So don't use them. I can say that clearly. Don't bother using them except for decoration. They're not worth it. They really, really are not. Over here, you have the ERA, and hello, what happened here? What happened here is that the ERA stopped the stream dead. Completely. So, where's that hole? Where'd that hole head? So, the block behind it is completely undamaged because ERA stops heat streams in their tracks and stops the fragments from spalling. So if you really want to stop incoming heat, you use ERA. That is what it is good for. That is its main purpose. And to its credit, it does a good job. The problem is, you now have a gap in here that is not going to stop further heat shells, and these friggin' APS guns tend to fire quickly. So if you want to use ERA, you absolutely need to repair it as fast as possible. The good news is that it repairs quite easily, so there's nothing in here, but repairing costs is 1.25. Oh wow. Get 1.25 destroyed in combat. So what that means is that these things, ERA is very cheap to repair. It's expendable armor. But enough about that, moving on. Here we have the heavy armor slopes in here. And what's happened here is you can see this block is damaged, but not as badly as over here with the applique panels. So what happened here? What happened here is the heat stream entered here, damaged this block. It managed to spawn in here, the fragment spawn destroyed the slope, but because it's such a tanky little block, it means that the block behind it is fine, which means this is actually a pretty good way of stopping heat, because these blocks have a lot of health, a lot of armor. Remember, fragments tend to be stopped easily by stuff with high AC, so that worked pretty nicely. And over here you get pretty good results for cheaper, because the poles, what happened? The poles. Shout out to anyone watching who's in Poland. So, this is the first block that spawned in here, and the fragment spawned, destroyed the pole, destroyed that, and damaged that block. So, that's a bit of a bugger, really. But however, this still works well because these poles are really cheap. They stop the heat shell, but a downslope of 2 meter heavy armor is about, well, it costs 25 materials. A 4 meter metal pole costs 15.7, so considerably less, 10 materials less. So if you want to keep your armor somewhat lighter and cheaper, using poles is actually a pretty good idea. And I believe that armor stacking still works with it. Or no, it doesn't. Never mind. Never mind, never mind, it does not. In fact, armor stacking doesn't work with any of these at all. So that's 4 different ways to stop it. Like, these 3 are the way you want to consider. Forget applique panels, they're crap. Over here now, and last but definitely not least, we have spaced armor. And spaced armor is your go-to to dealing with heat and also HESH, but you deal with them in slightly different ways. So over here, these blocks count as having air gaps around them because, well, they're not fully blocked, except for the ERA that has its own special properties. Over here you have a heat gun. Is that a heat gun? Yes, it is. You have a HESH gun, and HESH is special. So for those of you who don't know, HESH is squash head, and HESH stands for high explosive squash head, and in real life terms, what that is, it is a usually quite a big shell, and it's got a big dollop of high explosive, well, I guess putty you could call it, inside the shell, and when it hits armor, it spreads out, flattens out against the surface's armor, and detonates, and sends a shockwave, a thump, through the armor. That doesn't really damage the armor at all, but it creates fragments on the other side. So shockwave goes through, it causes bits to fragment off on the other side of the armor, the idea being that it kills the crew of whatever's inside the tank, remember, talk in real life here, and shreds the insides. And in real life, only the British ever use that, and it is obsolete nowadays because there's way too many ways to counter it. You can just have like a thin, like, air gap that catches the spalling, you could, or spalling, I guess. Spalling? I don't know. Or you can just have the insides of your tank padded, which catches the spalling as well. So in real life, HESH is obsolete. It is no longer an effective anti-tank round. It's outdated. And from the depths, it's really, really good. Largely because, well, air gaps have to be big, and padding is an exact science, as we'll talk about right now. So what we have here is 3 different layers. So we've got 2-meter layer of metal and another layer of metal behind it. I thought it was wood for some reason just because of the color. And over here we have 2 layers of metal and a layer of wood, air gap, and then metal. So what does that mean? Well, for a start, you'll notice this air gap behind here is quite big, and that's important because heat and HESH fragments tend to spread out a lot, like once they've been spawned. And so the bigger the air gap, the more they spread out and the less likely they are to destroy individual blocks. So big is better in this case. A large ship with air gaps in it tends to survive these anti-armor shells a bit better than things that are more compact. But enough about that, I will now demonstrate to you what happens when you fire these things. So to start off with, we have the heat gun, and this, if nothing else, shows off just how strong the fragments from heat are. Because what we have here, okay, that block is fine, so is this block. Oh dear. That is a layer of metal that just got, well, prettily royally shredded by that heat shell. Like, this is a big shell, by the way. This is a 500mm heat shell. It hurts a lot if it hits something. Heat is very powerful. Very meta these days. So that's what heat does to you. And HESH also is a very powerful shell, but it's a little bit more specialized in its use. So firing at the same thing. Bang! Lots of fragments. It has actually destroyed that first block there and damaged the one behind it because it does thump damage, sending a shockwave through, damaging a lot of blocks, and thankfully making quite a narrow hole here. Narrow vertical hole. And it has put an even bigger hole in the layer of metal behind that because this is where I mentioned earlier that fragments across the board have an AP value of 6. The exception to that is the spalling created by HESH shells. When HESH shells spawn fragments, so this is how it's spawned, so like, basically higher this number, the more fragments there are, higher the thump damage, the more thump damage there is. The fragments spawned by HESH have double the AP of whatever armor class the block they spawn from. So, metal has an AP value of 15. It doesn't have an armor value of crap, it definitely doesn't. So, which means that HESH fragments that spawn off metal blocks have an AP of 30, which means they do full damage to other metal beings. And that is a really powerful thing, because it means that if your craft is essentially a hollow metal box, it is going to get shredded by HESH, because it just means the outsides will get thumped into pieces, and the insides will get shredded by fragments that actually have very high AP values on them. So, how do you counter that? Well, this is the answer. The fragments spawn at the first air gap they hit. So, over here, it'll thump through these two, and then it's wood. So, I'll let the results speak for themselves here. We're gonna fire. Bang! So, same thing again, block destroyed, block damaged. Almost nothing back here. Like, piddly damage right here from those HESH fragments, and that is because they spawn from wood, and wood has lousy armor. So, just checking again. Wood is an armor of 3. So, the HESH fragments that spawn from wood have an AP value of 6, which is back to regular fragment strength. Which means that the layer of metal behind here didn't even get tickled. Like, this is nothing, really. So this is Spall Liner, and it reflects how, in real life, tanks tend to have padded interiors to stop this kind of thing. So yeah, that's basically it. If you want to counter HESH, Spall Liner is basically an absolute must. The alternative is to make armor so thick that the thump can't reach through it. That is expensive and not really reliable, so wouldn't recommend that. And that basically does it for this part 2 of this tutorial. It's covering the more specialized kinds of damage. As I said before, energy weapons don't play nice with armor because they ignore armor stacking, and they don't they don't have specific properties like HESH and heat shields do. They just ignore armor stacking, and I believe that the armor penetration calculation is the same as kinetic shells, apart from the lack of armor stacking. So, my throat hurts and I'm hungry. Okay. Thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I will see you next time in From the Depths. Hope this has been helpful. Hope you're having a lovely day. Farewell.